Hello, my Econ students. We are starting our last unit here, unit number 6, talking about international trade and international economics. As you can imagine, of all the different disciplines and areas of study of economics that there are, this is one of the more complex ones because we're talking about transactions across the world instead of just in a small, confined geographical region. So naturally, this can be a little bit complex. The good news for you all is I'm going to keep it as simple as I possibly can. Just give you the bare basics, and hopefully I won't lose anybody in the process. So where we're starting today is we're going to do this first part in Roman number 1, talking about the benefits of free trade. And so before I do this, however, I'm going to ignore this for a moment. I'm going to tell you guys a little story, okay, to help illustrate what we're talking about here. So this story takes place in the late 70s. Now, you may have heard this in U.S. history, so I apologize if you've already heard the story. You may have heard this already, but basically it goes like this. In the late 70s, there was a guy out in San Francisco. He developed a way of taking natural organic products, namely things like corn, wheat, and soybeans, and things like agricultural products, and he could take those agricultural products and turn them into fully functioning automobiles. So he had a special secret process. He had this big factory out in San Francisco, and he was taking organic products like corn and wheat and whatnot. He was putting them into his factory, and out came perfectly functioning automobiles. And I don't mean like some weird automobiles like made of corn, like normal automobiles made of steel and everything that we expect an automobile to be. Now, you might be saying, Mers, how is this possible? There was a lot of speculation about how he was doing this, but just ignore that for the moment and kind of follow the story. So, now, the cars that he was making out in San Francisco were as good, maybe even a little bit better than the cars that we were making in Detroit at the time, and actually a little bit cheaper. Okay, so he's taking corn, wheat, soybeans, things like that, putting them into a machine. Out are coming fully functioning automobiles, as good or better, and a little bit cheaper than the cars we were making in Detroit. Now, eventually, he was forced to reveal his secret, and I'll tell you all about that in just a moment. But before we get to that, let's try to think of who are the winners and losers that come out of this situation. Okay, so think about some of the winners. Who might some of the winners be? Certainly, automobile consumers, right? Any American who is buying an automobile. If you have access to automobiles that are as good or better and a little bit cheaper than the cars we're already making, consumers are going to benefit from this. Okay, definitely farmers, right? Corn, wheat, soybeans, all these types of farmers, they have a new demand for their product that's going to raise their prices for their product, that's going to make them more money. So farmers loved the situation. They thought it was pretty cool. Obviously, everybody involved in this guy's operation, all the people that work in his factory, that kind of stuff, they're all going to benefit, right? So those are some of the groups of people that benefit. Are there going to be any losers in the situation? Well, naturally, the car manufacturers that are in Detroit that have this new competition that's eating away at their market share and eating away at their profits, they're going to lose out in the situation. But the big question is this. As a whole, I'm hoping that you agree with me that the benefits were greater than the cost, that the number of people who benefited from the scenario that I just described outweighed or were bigger than the number of people who lost. And so, in general, it was a good thing for the economy. Okay, now, the big question, how did he do it? And this was gnawing at people for a long time, and there were all kinds of conspiracy theories on trying to explain how he was doing this, everything up to and including black magic. So eventually the day came where the government ordered him to open up the doors of his factory and reveal how it was he was making this happen. Okay, so the big day comes, they get a court order, the press, the media shows up, this is a big thing. They open up the guy's doors, and guess what they find? He's not turning corn and wheat into cars at all. You know what he's doing? He's taking the corn and wheat and stuff like that, he's putting them on ships. He's sending it over to Japan, and in return, Japan is sending back the automobiles. Okay, now, I'm going to be honest, that whole story was made up. Nothing like that happened. But let me tell you why I did that, other than just to mess with your minds, which I like to do. Let me tell you why I did that. be completely honest here with yourself. If I had started the conversation this way, if I had said, you know guys, back in the 1970s, Japan started to overtake our car industry. Be honest, your first thought probably would have been, oh my gosh, that's terrible. What are we going to do about this, right? The reason I phrased it in the way that I did, even though I know it's a weird story and all that, why did I do that? Because there are so many misconceptions and biases regarding international trade and good and bad and all that kind of stuff. I really wanted you to see at its core for what it was, it's a good thing. Okay, again, the fact that we're trading with Japan as opposed to taking corn and wheat and putting them into a machine and getting out automobiles doesn't really change anything. We still have the same winners and losers. And if originally you agreed that, hey, this was a good thing, hopefully you still agree that, yes, this is a good thing, okay? And so again, I phrased it that way because we have to get over some of these biases that we have, these misconceptions about trade, and understand that at its core, trade is a good thing. So let's explore real quick, what are some of the benefits, why trade is a good thing for us? Well, the first thing is, I think, the most obvious thing in the world. If you remember back one of the first days in this class, we did this little game where I gave you a baggie, a brown paper bag with a couple of goodies in it, and I gave you guys the opportunity to trade. And the big takeaway from that activity was this, that trade doesn't take place unless both parties benefit. Okay, trade does not take place unless both parties benefit. Now, that's not only true individually, it's also true internationally. Okay, that reality doesn't stop at a border. Guys, I always like to think of it this way. Borders are political. They're not economic. Okay, that's important. Borders serve a political function. Borders are not economic, though. The realities that we've been talking about all semester long, they don't stop at imaginary lines or at rivers or wherever the border is from one state to the next or one country to the next. Economics transcends borders, right? So if two people don't trade unless it benefits them, the same is true internationally. If we're trading with China, or we're trading with Japan, or we're trading with Russia or France or Brazil or Mexico or whoever, it must be benefiting both parties. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. That's the benefit of free trade and voluntary exchange, right? It doesn't happen unless both are benefiting. So at its core, even with all the other arguments, you can say, well, if nations are trading, it must be benefiting both parties, otherwise they don't do it. But let's get into a couple details of why it's good. Two reasons, especially why international trade brings benefits. Now, in parentheses, you might notice here I have Nafta. Okay, I'm going to talk about Nafta in a second. It stands for North America Free Trade Agreement. So hold on to that thought for the moment. But let's look at these two big benefits that we get from international trade. The first one, the most obvious one, is specialization. Okay, here's what's real cool. As we talk about specialization, tomorrow's worksheet, which is worksheet number 19, talks about comparative and absolute advantage. I love comparative and absolute advantage because in a very simple way, using concrete numbers, we can see why nations benefit from trade. Okay, and the bottom line is, let's just stick with it right here though. Nations are good at some things, they're okay at others, some things they really stink at. It just depends on what it is, right? So for us, there are certain things we tend to do really well because of the infrastructure that we have as a nation, because of the geography and the land, whatever. There are some things that we can grow, some things that we can produce and manufacture, other things that we simply don't have the right tools, the right climate to do, right? So by specializing, by doing what we're really good at and allowing other people to do what they're really good at, in the end, we all end up with more, okay? So it's kind of like, I always like to think about it this way. So I'm sure you've seen bumper stickers and certainly people that will say, buy American, right? And they'll say, hey, we should buy things. Now, the philosophy is pretty simple behind that, right? If we buy American, why is that a good thing for our country? Well, because if we buy American, the money stays in America. That stimulates the American economy, and that creates jobs for Americans, right? And that's good. That benefits us because we're Americans. Well, by that logic, wouldn't it be even better to only buy things made in Kentucky? Because we live in Kentucky, right? So if we only buy things made in Kentucky, the money stays in Kentucky, That stimulates the economy of Kentucky, and that creates jobs for Kentuckians, and that benefits us because we live in Kentucky. Well, we don't, of course, just live in Kentucky. We live in a very specific part of Kentucky, namely Lexington. You may live in one of the regional, the surrounding cities, but let's just say Lexington, right? So if you live in Lexington, wouldn't it be even better to only buy products made in Lexington? Because that would keep the money in Lexington, and that would create jobs for people in Lexington, and that would stimulate the economy of Lexington, and that benefits us because we live in Lexington. Well, by that logic, wouldn't it be even better to only buy products made within our neighborhood? Let's say that you live in Heartland, right? If you only buy products made by people in Heartland, it keeps the money in Heartland, it stimulates the economy of Heartland, and creates jobs for people in Heartland. Of course, the best case scenario, by this logic, is to only buy products made within your own home. If you never left your house, and by the way, this is a great example we're learning right now of why it does benefit us to leave our house. We are all going crazy, and we don't have access to the same things we used to have access to. But let's follow this for a second. If we only bought products made within our house, the money would stay in our house. That would create jobs for people in our house, right? And that would benefit us because we live in our house. Now, the problem with that is, of course, as we are learning as I speak, the problem with that is if we only bought products made within our home, we'd all end up alone and poor. So here's the thing. I think we recognize that it can benefit my house to trade with other houses. My house can't make it all. We can't have all the things we need and use on a regular basis. And I think we also recognize that it can benefit my neighborhood to trade with other neighborhoods, because whatever we have in my particular neighborhood, we can't do it all, we can't have it all. We also recognize it benefits our city to trade with other cities, because Lexington can't make everything we need. We do some things well, horses, bourbon and whatnot, right? But other things we don't do so well. We don't grow oranges so well in Lexington and a lot of things, right? So we know it can benefit our city to trade with other cities, and I think we also recognize it can benefit our state to trade with other states, right? We do some things like horses and tobacco and whatnot really well. We don't do oil as well. We don't do steel as well. Like I say, growing citrus fruits and things like that. You know, coal, we do good. There are some things our state does good, some things we don't do good. So I think we recognize it can benefit our state to trade with other states. Again, my question is, why does that have to stop at a border? If it can benefit my home to trade with other homes, and my city to trade with other cities, and my state to trade with other states, why can't it benefit my nation to trade with other nations? It certainly can, because by doing so, we get the benefits of specialization, and the bottom line is all nations end up having more things. And like I say, if you still don't believe me on that, wait till tomorrow's worksheet. When we see comparative and absolute advantage, we'll see the numbers and how it shows that. So anyway, the number two reason why trade benefits us, brings greater wealth, is because of economies of scale. So quick reminder, we talked about this in a previous unit. Economies of scale is the idea that you produce on a bigger scale. So think about mass producing, building a big factory to make whatever, cookies or cars or whatever. And by producing on such a large scale, you actually increase your efficiency and lower your average costs. Okay? So that's the idea of economies of scale. Well, when we trade internationally, we can either get economies of scale that should say would not exist otherwise. In other words, there might be a product that you have to produce on such a large scale that if you only sold it within your nation, you could not possibly produce and sell enough to make it worthwhile or to make it efficient. Okay, that's a possibility. Or let's say you already have your economies of scale. Maybe it allows for even greater economies of scale. You can build a car factory and produce even more cars and trade them to other nations and make it even more efficient, make it even cheaper. Okay, so you either get specialization or economies of scale. Let me come back real quick and end with this thought, and that is Nafta. Nafta, like I said, stands for North America Free Trade Agreement. Okay, what Nafta did essentially is it opened up borders between America, Canada, and Mexico, our three bordering nations, to allow goods and services and workers to flow more freely between the nations. Now, when Nafta was being first debated in the early 90s, the big concern by its opponents was that Nafta would create all kinds of unemployment for Americans. The fear was that if we open up borders, One, a bunch of American companies are going to flee to Mexico to take advantage of cheap labor, and or a bunch of migrant workers from Mexico are going to come up here and take our jobs. Either one or both of those are going to happen, and unemployment is going to skyrocket in America. Well, lo and behold, Nafta was passed in '93, I believe, by Bill Clinton, and the result was actually interesting. Number one, America gained jobs. In other words, the unemployment rate in America went down. The unemployment rate in Canada went down. And the unemployment rate in Mexico went down. Now you say, wait a minute. How is it possible that all three nations gained jobs? Well, guess what? The economy is not a zero-sum game. In other words, there's not just a certain number of jobs in the world, and that's all there is, and that's all there's ever going to be. So if one nation has more jobs, another nation has fewer jobs, guess what? As nations grow, and as nations develop, and as nations prosper, jobs are created. And as the three of our nations opened up borders to trade, and each nation benefited from trade like we've been talking about, all three nations experienced growth and job creation. And it was a benefit for all three nations. And that's a great example, even though NAFTA is still being attacked by some people, that's a great example of how trade can benefit all nations involved. Okay, so that's just kind of the philosophic overview of it. Like I say, tomorrow's worksheet, worksheet 19, is going to put some real hard numbers to it and show that yes, trade can, even if we could do everything better ourselves than every other nation in the world, we could still benefit from trade. And that's what we're going to see with tomorrow's worksheet. So if you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, hopefully that made sense. And of course, till next time, stay healthy and happy.